We'll kind of end this consideration of agape love, covenant love, by comparing and contrasting two kinds of love. Not using Greek terms here, but now coming back to the concept of covenant. I want to compare covenant love with what you might call contract relationships. Covenant versus contract. Interesting thing about covenants and contracts. On the outside, they look very similar, right? I mean, both covenants and contracts have two or more parties that make some kind of an agreement. The agreement's made very clear in particular terms, and there is a promise to keep to these terms, or there'll be consequences, namely damage to the relationship. But those similarities betray a very important difference between contracts and covenants. Let's think through the uniquenesses and differences of covenant as opposed to the many contractual relationships we see in our culture. On one hand, covenant requires other-orientedness, a way of life in which others are put ahead of self. On the other hand, contracts are almost by definition self-centered, because who goes into a contract for the better of the other party? One enters contracts because there's something one is hoping to gain from this relationship, and one wants that to be protected. Contracts are virtually by definition self-oriented. Covenants, other-oriented. Then, secondly, on the other hand, covenants unite people. Well, interestingly, contracts, because the contract itself mediates between the two people, contracts actually separate parties. So while covenants bind people as one, contracts make it very clear there are two separate parties here, and this contract will negotiate the relationship. It's a separation of sorts. Third, covenant is based on trusting your other covenant partner. There's a statement in the Bible, in the New Testament, one of Paul's letters, that says, whatever is not of faith or trust, same idea in Greek, whatever is not of faith or trust is sin. This is an important consideration in covenants. If I am not trusting my covenant partner, I'm actually sinning against them by not giving them my trust. Unless, of course, they've done something to be untrustworthy. But in terms of going into a covenant and living in the covenant, unless someone's done something to show me they're untrustworthy, I am called as a covenant commitment to them to give them my trust. Lack of trust breaks covenant. On the other hand, contract, well, the whole reason there is a contract is because we don't trust each other. We have to trust in the contract and the court system and the lawyers to make sure this thing happens, because we're not sure the other party will do what they say. Fourthly, the terms of a covenant are simply expressions of how agape love is going to be shown in this particular relationship. So terms, or the stipulations of a covenant, those should just flow out of the natural agape love that's already there between the parties. For contracts, on the other hand, the terms really become legalistic have-tos. I'm not doing this now because love of my partner leads to this. I'm doing this because the contract says if I don't, I'm in trouble. Fifth, covenants are far more demanding than contracts are. The truth is about covenants is the terms are never done. One never gets to the end of a day and says, well, I can check off the list of my covenant promises. I've loved you significantly enough. Now, one might have loved the party well, but the heart of a covenant keeper is always to move deeper, more completely, more fully, more sacrificially into this loving relationship, not do a checklist. Contracts, quite the opposite. As soon as I've kept my contractual obligations, I'm done. That's the point of the contract, is to let me know what I have to do and what I don't have to do for this to be a working relationship. And finally, maybe one of the most significant differences of all is what happens in a contract as opposed to a covenant when someone breaks the terms. In a contract, we know what happens. That's the whole point of the contract, is to be able to tell very clearly the negative consequences that will happen if someone breaks the terms of this covenant, of this contract. Back to court maybe, lawyers involved, who knows? Depending on the contract, it could be one is fined for breaking it all the way to jail time. There are negative consequences that are built into contractual arrangements. But in covenant, the heart of the two covenant parties for each other is that when one breaks the covenant, as painful and as much suffering is involved there, one is called to extend covenant mercy to one's covenant partner. The hope is not to call down the curses of covenant on them. Rather, the hope is to call them back, to woo them back to the relationship, to heal that which is broken, to offer forgiveness and mercy rather than judgment and the negative consequences of contractual sort of obligations. So you see that at every point, from its heart to its intentions to its consequences in terms of what happens when the covenants or contract is broken, there's a lot of differences between contractual versus covenantal relationships. And I propose to you that agape love is the only love that's going to give covenant that ability to operate covenantally as opposed to contractually. With this kind of picture of God's love, God who is agape, we can understand why this God is the covenant-keeping God, and why this God, the triune God of Jesus Christ, calls us into covenant agape love relationships with himself, with each other, and even Jesus says to love ourselves, to treat ourselves as the images of God we are, and to steward the creation with a loving agape character that he's called us to. The four directions of love. Powered, empowered by the very love of God himself, and us just flowing through and to that love towards others as we carry out the covenant responsibilities of God's people in this world. There's the mission of God in Jesus Christ and what we are called to participate in as his church.